My name is Colin Khoury, and I direct our Science and Conservation Department here at the garden. There are several members of that department and from horticulture and some other parts of the garden here in the crowd, and then some visitors, and you all are very welcome. Uh, this talk, so this science seminar series has been going on for a couple of years now, a collaboration between education and science and conservation, and I have wanted to give this talk over those 2 years at least 3 or 4 times, and it hasn't happened because of our busyness. And so this is finally the day where I finally get to give, really honestly, the talk that I enjoy giving the most of all. And it has different forms depending on the audience. It can be everything from a very sciencey talk to a very public talk, and I'm going to try to go somewhere in the middle today, and would appreciate you keeping me on track by the degree to which you understand what I'm talking about. Feel free to raise your hand and ask me questions, or stop me and say you don't know what's going on. Why is this my favorite talk? It integrates a lot of the work that I've done over decades, honestly, and it talks about my favorite subject, which is food and food diversity. And it's a story that has a lot of celebration. It also is a story that has some scary elements to it, I think, or some worries and concerns. And so we're going to go on that journey together and arrive somewhere that I don't know where we will arrive, because I don't know the end of this story. I always gain something from the interaction, and so I really do appreciate your thoughts on it. Sound good? Cool. Okay, so it has 3 chapters, and we'll start with chapter 1. All right, so I grew up around here. I grew up in Escondido, and I was lucky. I feel really lucky to have grown up not only in peopled areas, urban areas, let's say suburban areas, but also on the edge of wild spaces and also agriculture. In this case, it was avocados and citrus. And I was parked by my mom underneath avocados and citrus growing up. I have memories of kind of looking up at fruit trees. And my mom, I believe, must have said this term, you are what you eat, when I was young, because I remember thinking about it and thinking like, okay, when I eat this avocado, like it's becoming me. But also like, am I becoming like an avocado? And it's like this kind of like kid thinking about it, which I still have in some ways. And this guy, Arcimboldo, an Italian painter from 500 years ago, I feel like maybe we had similar childhoods. He did a series of paintings like this that are all biographic figures. In this case, of a royal person in Austro Germany of the time, and they're all either fruits and vegetables or meats or different types of food, essentially, that put together a person. And so, "you are what you eat" is a term that I think is mostly used to talk about like eating healthfully, right? It's an admonishment that moms say to kids. That's not the way we're going to talk about it today. It's really an access point to talk about where food comes from, and maybe where we're going with our food journey, and what that means about who we are, and maybe what we're becoming. Um, okay, so I've been lucky to travel a lot in my career. And when I was young, I started to travel to places far away from me, certainly Mexico City, Buenos Aires in Argentina, um, Tokyo, Vietnam. And I saw foods there that, frankly, for me at the time, they confused me. They weren't what I imagined was going to be there. And they were familiar, but they were from the other side of the world. And so there were things like this, and they fascinated me. This was recognizable to me as a hamburger. This is called the Viet Mac burger. And it's a small chain in Hanoi, at least, maybe other parts of Vietnam. And you can notice it looks like a hamburger, but it also has these variations on that. It's a wheat, instead of a wheat bun, it's a rice bun that you can see there. There's some cilantro in there instead of just the lettuce and tomato. So I thought that was really fascinating. And I saw that, I saw pizza in Mexico City and all of these things. And I was like, wow, I was surprised. And I feel like maybe this is several decades ago. Maybe it's not so surprising now, but it was surprising a couple decades ago to me. And I I felt a mixed feeling about the experience. I felt on one side that um, it was kind of neat that we were all connected by food, I suppose. Like that there was hamburgers over there and there was pizza over there and all of that. On the other side, frankly, it felt kind of inauthentic, like this wasn't the real food of Vietnam. That was the feeling I had. But it started a journey for me then to try to understand like how long we've been trading and mixing and matching foods. Was this just something from the last couple of decades, what we call globalization, the recent period of so much interconnectedness by the internet and jet airplanes and all of that stuff, or has it gone back further? And so I started a journey of understanding that, which has led to a series of shocking discoveries for me at the time, and perhaps not shocking for you, but for me. And that was that um, there are these whole set of dishes around the world that we consider to be of a place, and they are, like this flatbread dish that is conceivably, arguably the most famous dish in the world, and the most widespread known dish in the world, thought to be from Italy, right? And yet, if you look at the ingredients within them, I started to realize that actually they don't come from Italy. Major ingredients like tomatoes that actually come from this side of the world, from the New World, and arrived there a couple hundred years ago and were integrated into the cuisine to become something that now is like the penultimate Italian dish, and of course pasta as well, right? And so that was like, okay, so it wasn't just like the last decade. It's been a while that we've been mixing and matching these things, and it's not just tomatoes. Here's another example from the old world: Southeast Asian cuisine. That spiciness, that spice is also from this side of the world. Chili peppers are entirely from the New World. That means the Western Hemisphere, if you will, the Americas. And so it's like, can you think about Southeast Asia cuisine and think about it not having chili peppers in it? It's very difficult, right? And so that's fascinating. So it goes back, it goes back a while, at least a couple hundred years. And I don't have a picture of it, but the foods that we think about around here that are so like kind of fundamental San Diego cuisines, like tacos or burritos, frankly, I think are the things that connect us the most. Also, those things are not, they're not all from Mexico, what's in them. Like actually, if you pick apart a taco, most of the ingredients are actually from other parts of the world. And so, um, and so how long have we been mixing and matching and trading and integrating and taking in foods from other places? Well, it actually goes back a really long time. It goes back at least to the beginning of agriculture, which is in different places of the world 4,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago. And so this is a map that I've been working on for a while that is more or less in regions where crops were domesticated, or where their diversity was really important and were used to domesticate, and became the really important crops around the world. There are, of course, other crops that we eat. This is constrained by the 80 or so crops that the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's Statistical Office measures around the world of how much is produced and how much is consumed. And so I don't have pinpoints of exactly where they're domesticated because nobody really knows that. But we know the regions, more or less, if that makes sense. And so perhaps a couple of things might come out of this for you. One very important one for me. I have a memory of high school of being taught, I don't know if that would have been history or social studies or what it was, that agriculture came from one place, which is entirely wrong. And I don't know if anybody else has that memory or not. And that place is this place, the West Asia, the Fertile Crescent, this area, which is an incredibly important place with many crops that came from there. And a long time ago that started, 12,000 years ago or more. But it's wrong to say that that's the only place that food was innovated, that people and plants and also livestock came together in this increasingly symbiotic and interdependent way in which we needed them and they needed us. All of these, well, so many cultures from around the world that were innovating over those thousands of years. And so the current best thinking about this now is that there are at least 28 to 32 kind of mega centers of innovation around the world, which were indigenous peoples that that were innovating, like perhaps the greatest innovations of all time, if you think about it in a certain way of like of the impact on people forever into the future. And so so that's one thing. it came from all over the place. And then another thing is that there is some variation in difference. And for instance, in North America, that list is a bit smaller than some other parts of the world. Um, if you have other thoughts, we can talk about that as we move on. But let's talk about North America or the United States for a bit. And so my next point in the journey was, could I then figure out how much of the American diet, the American food supply, as is measured by the United Nations, in a way that we can know more or less what the total amount of food in the United States, in terms of, in this case, crops of plants, of what it is. We have information on that. Like, where does that come from in that deep history of where was it domesticated, and where did it arise? And so let's start with our most famous known food in the world, which we are known from around the world and celebrated. People love hamburgers. I mean, and so let's play a little bit of game here. And let's start with the stuff on top, these seeds, sesame seeds. Does anybody know where sesame seeds happen to come from? Good guess, but where does sesame, where is that in New York City? Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good, New York City is a hot spot. It's a, what do you call it? It's a melting pot, which is a wonderful, that is where many things come from, is melting pots, for sure. Anybody have any other ideas about sesame? Well, come from Iran. We have an Iranian in the audience, the Middle East. So for the botanists in the crowd, it's Sesamum indicum, if that's helpful to you. That's not always helpful, though. Botanists get things wrong. So for instance, chili peppers, again, there were botanists in Asia that called one of the chili pepper species Capsicum chinense, referring to China, because they thought, I mean, it was everywhere, and they thought, okay, it comes from here. It didn't. They were confused. Anyway, Sesamum indicum comes from South Asia, from the Indian subcontinent in its origins, but of course made it to Iran very early on, a long time ago, and all of that. But how about the most important food in the American diet is this one here. It's so hated by some parts of society for complex, convoluted reasons, but it is our most important food of all in terms of our calories in the United States. Anybody know where wheat comes from? The Fertile Crescent. So it is that West Asian thing that I was taught was the only place that all of this stuff comes from. Good. What about onions? I'm sorry? Yeah, good guess. So actually, onions and tomatoes I'll put together. They're really a little bit from more West Asia, Central Asia, but they made their way to Europe fairly early on, and so they're known. They've been there a long time, like that. And so, and we talked about tomatoes. Last one, let's talk about. Well, actually, let's talk about cows for a minute. Beef. Good guess. All right, did I see? Those are our associations that we have. Mongolia. Awesome. So there are a couple of subtypes of cow, by the way, around the world, but the major one that's eaten is from West Asia, kind of into Central Asia again. And the other one is also from the Old World. There's no cow that is a livestock now that is from the Western Hemisphere. Um, Fair enough. Fair enough. We'll get to innovations in a little bit here. Last one, pickles or cucumbers, if you didn't know what pickles were. From Iran. No. No. Not exactly, actually. Not exactly. But I love the enthusiasm. Anybody else? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to say one other thing, and it's kind of a note because it's a long subject itself. We don't know equally around the world all of this history because, frankly, some parts of the world have been better studied. Some parts are safer and alternatively less safe to do this work with. This work is archaeology, it's linguistics, it's botany, it's all kinds of work that comes together to understand these things. Um, and there's also kind of historical traditions and colonization and all kinds of things that come together in terms of what we know. But another reason is actually biological. Drier parts of the world where things are preserved and hang out longer are better documented than wetter parts of the world. And so this is probably from a wetter part of the world and less, and also more dangerous, honestly, which is kind of South Asia into Southeast Asia, what is now Myanmar, Western Myanmar area, which was also kind of an eggplant, cucumber center of domestication area, probably, but nobody really knows totally. Anyways, okay, so this American thing is actually a global meal. It's our local twist, if you will, on a global cornucopia. And nothing, in fact, is North American about this dish. But of course, it was created not by native North Americans, if you want to call it that, for whatever that's useful. It was created by also this whole mixture of people who came here from all other parts of the world. Oh, well, tomatoes, yeah. So I skipped it because we talked about it very quickly earlier on, but tomatoes are from South America. Interesting story there. I'm like throwing out little things we can talk about later, but tomatoes as wild plants are from coastal Peru, Ecuador area, but they were probably domesticated in actually in Mexico and Mesoamerica. Hi, welcome. And so how did they get there? Well, probably from birds that dispersed wild plants that really are native. We know all the wild relatives are from down there, came up to Central America and were domesticated by peoples further north. All right, so I didn't want to just do hamburgers, but I wanted to do, as promised, the entire diet, the entire American diet. And so we actually don't know the diet of Americans, but we know the food supplies of Americans. So what is a food supply? It's the total produced in this country plus the total that was imported in this country. So all of the food, and this is just plants because we're in the Botanic Garden and we're talking about plants here. We love plants. This is the total produced and imported minus everything we export, everything that goes to feed and seed and waste and all that stuff. So this is everything that's available that gets used every year back and forth in the flow of our food supply. And so this is measured in terms of calories in just in these regional parts of the world. And what we can see is that the majority of our diet comes from North Africa into the Fertile Crescent area of West Asia. And then a large part also comes from over here. Some down here, you can probably not see it too well on the screen, but only actually less than 1% from this part of the world. That's our calories. If you want to measure it instead by what US farmers produce, so this is measured in terms of production value of US farm production, where those crops originated. Our connections are also to other parts of the world. And so our biggest connection is to Mexico and Central America. Any guesses on the sort of crops that come from there? So our number one crop in terms of value of production in the country is maize, corn, and that connects us to that place. But not just corn, a bunch of other things too. And then what about this other one on the East Asia side? It's an educated crowd here. Good. So soybeans are our number two crop in this country, and they are from what is now China, and a bunch of other things. And again, less than 5% coming from this region of the world. So we are eaters that have absorbed and appreciate, benefit from, suffer from stuff from all over the world, and we are producers that also are global. We are global. I don't want you to think, though, that us North Americans have done nothing for the world. In this historical tradition of food domestication and spread around the world. And there is one crop, there are many crops that were domesticated here, bless you, but there is one that is probably the most important in terms of calories in people's diets around the world, and that is the sunflower. And I find it a little bit funny and a little bit sad that we don't celebrate the sunflower as much, actually. We think about it as like baseball and cracking seeds or whatever, but sunflower is an incredibly important cooking oil in many parts of the world, including Eastern Europe. Ukraine is one of the world's biggest producers, or has been one of the world's biggest producers of sunflower. In Turkey, it is second only to olive oil as the most important cooking oil. It's very important in East Africa, Southern Africa, Australia, and many other places. So it is a very important food. Now, what is this painting? This is Van Dyck, a self-portrait. So this is a Flemish painter, and this is not that long, less than 100 years after this plant was moved to Europe, which is only after, of course, the Columbian Exchange, post 1492, of course, actually a couple hundred years after that. And what I love about this is it shows how important sunflowers are. Sunflowers did come in via botanic gardens into Europe, but then became more global for a whole bunch of really fabulous reasons that, if we have time and if you allow me, I will tell some of the stories about sunflowers after I'm done with our main 3 chapters here. But why we know that this is already a demonstration of importance here is that well, I've read enough to know that in paintings of the time, when sunflowers showed up and when they showed their face towards the person, that meant basically that the person was being looked upon positively. And then if you look at the gold chain and all of that, you start to realize that basically this is what we would call like an Instagram selfie of the present. This is like I am pretty great in botanical form is what this is by Van Dyke. And so it's part of our North American impact to the world as well. All right, so I didn't want to just do this for the United States. I was really interested in the whole world, and like, is this just an American phenomenon of this global story, or is it everywhere? And so I wanted to map for every country. Having every country in a circle is too many, so I've grouped this into regions. This is every region of the world, and if you see up at 12 o'clock, that's North America. That is the food supply of North America, which is the US and Canada, more or less. It's population weighted, so it actually looks more like the American diet than the Canadian diet, which is a little different, but not that different. The folks from Vancouver can argue with me after, if you like. So this is going to show the North American diet. This is Central America, Mexico, Caribbean countries, Andean countries, tropical South America, temperate South America, 4 parts of Africa, the Indian Ocean islands, 4 parts of Europe and the South and East Mediterranean, West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific islands, and Australia and New Zealand. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to draw lines that are where the foods come from. And if you look at the colors will also have those same colors, and they will connect to the places where those foods are so important in terms of calories. And so I'm just going to map the most important lines first, the biggest caloric contributions first, so we can break it down and then show you the whole graph. And so if you look at this orange one here, this is a thick line that are Central American and Mexican crops that are incredibly important in South Africa. They already map out as one of the most important lines in the whole graph. Any idea what crops those would be that are so important in Southern Africa? Particularly one. This is a very educated crowd. So the most important caloric source across the entire diet in Southern Africa, that's South Africa, Tanzania, sorry, not Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Zambia, that area is corn. Formerly, sorghum, millets, and other things has been more or less displaced by corn in the last couple hundred years. And so, so you can see corn there. It's other crops too from that area, but corn is the main one that lines it up. You can see that. And then there's this whole set of things that come from kind of the Fertile Crescent and are already super important in Europe and important in Australia and some other places. So those are wheat, barley, chickpeas, lentils, the Fertile Crescent crops. Frankly, this map is already basically the 3 big cereals that you see here. This is corn, this is wheat, and then there's one more thing going on over here out of Southeast Asia, South Asia. Any idea what that one is? Rice. Very good. So this is our top 3 cereals that are already showing how incredibly important they are. But that's not the whole picture. When you then map all the lines of importance of all the crops from every region around the world, where they come from and where they're important, you end up with this, which is a hopelessly complicated dream catcher of interconnectedness of where our food comes from in that great story of thousands of years and where we eat it now. This is our deep interconnectedness. And so if we are what we eat and where are we from, I would posit that although our local traditions, which we all have, this wonderful San Diegan food and all of this stuff, they tie us to place. Underneath that, the diversity that composes those dishes and those foods really do tie us to everywhere. We have local twists on a global story of food at this point in history, for sure. And I mean, I personally think about that and how much I've benefited growing up around avocados and citrus, both not from this region of the world, and so many other foods. And frankly, in this time period, bless you, when we can feel so separate from each other and so much strife, it's powerful to me to look down at my plate and realize how interconnected we are in the great global story of humanity. Just one or two more slides, and then we go to chapter 2. So if that was way too artistic for you and you want something more sciencey, what we have done here is boil it down for every country, how much of the diet is local versus really from somewhere else, from another region of the world, how much of the food supply. And so the darker color is more from somewhere else. And you can see a bit of a latitudinal difference in the low latitudes, the tropics. There's more of, you might call it, a bit more of a traditional diet. And there are still some places like Cambodia that up to 70, 80, 90% of the diet is still food that was originated in that region. That's largely, again, rice. And as you go towards the higher areas, it's more and more from other places. But the more important story is there is no country in the world and no region of the world that eats only its own food. Not one. Those are some statistics if you want to see them. And that's not just true about what we eat, but also what we produce. So again, this is a story of how much American farmers, that dark green, are producing foods that come from somewhere else, that Canadian farmers and everything around. And it's the same story of nobody produces food that only comes from its own region too. It's really a global story now of these things. All right, so I want to ask, is this just a story of rich countries and rich places, of how much we've absorbed from other places? I don't think so. This is a picture taken by a friend in Tanzania in a wet market, an informal market, what we call a farmer's market. And so this is not brought in by big supermarkets, and it's not brought in by airplanes. This is very local food, tradition stuff. I don't see a single crop in this picture that's from Africa. So I think it's a global story. I mean, I really think the benefits, if you want to call it that, are everywhere. I want to take a minute and just say the story of how plants got to all these places is a very complicated story. I do believe that most farmers share things very willingly, and there's a lot of wonderful parts of this story. There's also every other dark, wonderful and dark part of human history in this story, every part. Slavery, the movement of people across that didn't want to be moved. All of that stuff is in this story of how plants got to places. But that doesn't mean that these plants haven't benefited us in so many ways in our modern story. Jackson.
The last slide where it says
yeah.
Is foreign crops, like, does that mean grown there or like
domesticated there? Yeah, so this is what American farmers, how much American farmers are producing crops that aren't North American in their origins. They came from somewhere else, like corn and soybeans and alfalfa and other things like that. So basically, if it was lighter, that would mean American farmers were growing pecans, cranberries, sunflowers, and the few crops that really came from here. Mary. Yes, and your favorite statement. Yams are a complex group, actually, of several species that come from the pantropics. There's yams almost from everywhere in the tropics, from across here. So it depends on what yam you're talking about, but there are definitely African yams. Great questions. All right, and so Archimboldo. This painting is less than 100 years after 1492, and it's also super fascinating to me how quickly foods actually move and get integrated into other traditions, actually. And so there are literally ears of corn in this picture, and there's a heart of squash. Squash, the cucurbita group, is also from the Americas. And there's, I think, chili peppers down here, and this is a squash flower. There's already in the being of this European royal American crops, from the Americas. And this is also interesting because this is a royal, and I think it is in some ways also a story um, of you might call it colonization, but a story of imperial power in this painting as well. It's fascinating. Okay, so that's chapter 1. I think. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. I think that this might. Yeah. Who? I have an idea of this. But any ideas for the botanically minded? Ari, what's that? Oh, well, maybe. I think that this is covered up, so you don't always see it, but it's a food that's very often cooked, parched, and eaten in the streets of Italy. I think. I think it's a chestnut, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong about my chestnut morphology. I think it is. But yeah, there's some African crops in here. There's some very interesting things going on. There's a pomegranate. Cool. Figs. There's a pomegranate up here, Shala. Okay, so we should keep moving here. Okay, so this is a science seminar series, and we do have to show some graphs. Uh, so, um, so that's chapter 1, and I think really the story is that we are deeply globalized over a long history, and that is a long history of people from all over the world innovating, and then all this movement, which is the whole history of humanity, that makes a modern global food system that is incredibly, incredibly globalized and integrated and stretches back. What I want to show now in chapter 2 is what we really have data for, which is the last 50 years and what has happened with that food diversity in 50 years. And so this is data again from the United Nations, and in food supplies, this is measured for about 50 crops. So it's not everything, but it's the most important stuff that we eat. And I came into this research as a biodiversity person, a conservationist, and what I was looking for was how many crops have disappeared, how many plants are gone from our diets, and I found 0. None have disappeared. And I'm going to make a caveat about that in a minute. But what I found in this data set was actually every crop has actually increased in its spread around the world. So this is a simple actually graph. It shows every crop, but this is 50 years of change and the number of countries that are saying, yeah, we eat that. And you can see that the lines are actually going up for all these crops, which totally surprised me. Now here's the caveat. These are the winter crops. These are the globalized crops. These are the ones that have really spread around that were in that original map. We will talk in chapter 3 about the other ones that I think are disappearing around the world. But these are the winners, and they are winning.
What was the bottom? Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So that's only a couple. I don't know. I haven't been asked that in a while. I'll have to look up which one is not in not that many countries. Good question. All right, so these are scatter plots. They seem a little complicated. Every dot is a country, and it's just listing how many crops is in its diet, and out of those 50. And I'm actually measuring here not just calories, which most have been talking about, but 3 other ways that this data talks about our diets, which is contribution to protein, to fat in our diets, which we think of as bad, but is actually incredibly essentially important, and to weight in our diet. And some things just way more than others, like grapefruits. They won't come out in calories, but they'll come out in food weight, for instance. Okay, and so this is every country, and those lines are trend lines. They're the median trend, or if you want to call it the average trend across countries over time. And what also is seen in this data set is the equivalent of the same story. Every country is reporting eating a more diverse diet over the last 50 years, not less, which I thought was happening. For these winter crops, for these dominant crops, we are getting more diverse in global crops over the last 50 years. Not only that, but if you talk about the relative amount that we're eating of wheat versus potatoes versus grapefruits versus all the other foods, it's actually balancing out, which is this measurement that comes from ecology of evenness. It's getting a little more even over time. And the most dominant crop 50 years ago, for instance, rice in Thailand, is getting less dominant as things like wheat and potatoes come up in the diet. And so, and in many places that has some real positive to it, by the way, to skip forward to chapter 3 for a minute, and we can talk about that. So diets are getting more diverse for these winners crops. I hate to use that term, but it's a short term for what I'm trying to express here. And also diets are balancing out in the relative contribution of all these different things. As that's happening, diets around the world are getting more similar. And this is not a good enough demonstration, but it's a huge upward line there, and I want to show you it in a different way. So 50 years ago, if you plot this in a different way, every dot there is a country's diet, and the very central would be like the average, the global average diet, if you will, in the very middle. That line right there is a confidence interval. It's a statistical interval of uncertainty. The points on the very far outside are the really different diets around the world. 25 years later, this is the contraction that you get. And 25 years later, this is the contraction that you get. And so over 50, these are just some example countries. Over 50 years, so this story is not just like it happened 500 years ago with the Columbian Exchange, and then we've all got what we've got, and we're all eating globally. Just in the last 50 years, we've had tremendous diversity change. More diverse diets globally, like as in that global story, more balance, and then much more similarity. So what is this diet that we are honing in on? What is this global average? I think the last graph I'm going to show you. On the left side is the absolute change. And this is a complicated thing for me to even show because this is the total average across all diets around the world. It's a crazy thing to even show. Obviously, every one of us eats differently and every country eats differently. But if you average it completely, what you see on the left is that one, we eat more food than we did 50 years ago. And in many places, that's a very good thing. Two, the most important crops 50 years ago, the wheats and rices and sugar and maize are still really important. They're still up there. They just kind of hopped over. But three, there's some stuff that was important 50 years ago that kind of is dropping down, and there's some other stuff that's coming up. And that's basically the story of relative change that's over here. So if you were to go back and you wanted to make a bet as a commodity trader on, don't suggest, but on what would be the winners, there is one group of crops that by far has had the absolutely mega change in the last 50 years in our diets, and those are the oil crops. This is not tofu. It's not a measurement of tofu. This is soybean oil. This is sunflower oil, palm oil, canola. Those crops have gone hugely up in our diet. That has replaced lard and other animal fats. It's also just created more fat in the diet. A lot of diets that have moved from more steaming, water-based foods, like in Asia, East Asia, into more of a cooking, a frying type of diet. Positives and negatives to that. And then the decline, not disappearance, but marginalization in the diet has largely been the regionally traditional roots and tubers and cereals, sweet potatoes and yams and millets and sorghums and those ones. They're not disappearing, but they're becoming less important as other things like wheat and potatoes and obviously soybean and sunflower and all of that are coming up. This does not, because that would have gone out of the data set as other uses. Yeah, but that's a good question. So one point I also want to make here that I think is interesting is that although it is ridiculous to say like that there's a global average diet, we do all eat differently. I think what this data shows right here, and this last one here, is that that's a more true thing now than it was 50 years ago. Like we are converging on a global average of some sort, and maybe in another couple decades. I hope not, actually, but we get there. So so this is a botanic garden, and I would be remiss if I didn't make a couple of botanical jokes. I feel like it's also botanists around the world are in decline. We are an endangered species group in and of ourselves, so it's almost like my contractual obligation to make a few jokes, botany jokes. Uh, so we talk about the Anthropocene, and if anyone hasn't heard that, that's the idea that we are in a new geological epoch, if you will, planetary epoch in which humans have so much dominant influence on even the biogeochemical cycles on the planet that we're in a time period where humans really dominate things. Within that Anthropocene, I would posit, if you really think about how much dominance around the world of a very small group of plants, and let's not forget that agriculture, I haven't put the statistics on there, but agriculture itself, from which all this food comes, is the single greatest terrestrial ecosystem in the world. The largest ecosystem we have on this planet, on land, is agriculture. Then I would posit that we are in what I like to call the Triticurizacaleaceae. Triticurizacaleaceae. All right, we're going to play a game just to drive home the point of chapter 2, and then we finish there. And this is if you're not totally convinced of how globalized we are and how globalized we are becoming, even if our dishes look super differently, then we're going to talk about the top 10 plants in terms of calories in 3 countries whose diets on the outside look very, very different. Those countries, from left to right, but not necessarily left to right on the bottom, are Mexico, South Africa, and Sweden. These are relatively randomly chosen. And so your task is to match the country to the top 10 foods in its diet. And that's in descending order. So on the left, it's corn is the most important for calories in the diet, and then wheat, sugar, represented by sugarcane and sugar beet, rice, soybean, sunflower, that's barley and beer, which are mixed together in this data set, potatoes, that's other alcoholic beverages. There's some weird commodities that are difficult to deal with in this data, and then palm oil. In the middle, we've talked about them. This is beans, this is artificial sweeteners, and this is kind of an other fruits category here. Yep, artificial. Not sugarcane, artificial sweeteners. We talked about these already. This is rapeseed, otherwise known as canola oil. And this is kind of an other vegetables category here. That's other alcoholic beverages. Sort of thing, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to take some water, and then I'm going to, if you're feeling confident, this is a space, I hope it is a safe space to express how you feel about things. Then we can see where we're at. My point for you is actually not that you're going to be right. It's we're going to show that there's some confusion and some differences in the crowd here. Consumption. Not including animals. Yeah. All right. So if anyone is brave enough to start, would you just list left or right what the countries would be? So what we're going to do is, I can't move these things. So left to right, please. And then we're going to switch the flags around to line them up. So where are they? All right. So we've got Mexico, South Africa, Sweden.
I think Sweden is in the middle.
So, okay. So we're feeling good about Sweden. We're feeling about Mexico over here. Anybody else?
Artificial sweeteners.
That's a weird one. Making me feel like that.
But they use like real cane sugar or sodas.
Anybody feel absolutely confident? That's wonderful.
Things that look like eggs.
Soybeans? This is exactly what I want. All right, are we ready? Who's ready? You ready? South Africa, Mexico, Sweden. Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right.
That's my.
All right. So again, you're all winners because
Everyone
because
gets like, come on.
because this is a global story. And it's really hard to know if you look underneath the meatballs and the tacos and the sasa, the crops themselves, the actual biological entities that we're eating, we share so much of actually the same things. All right. Yeah, unfortunately, that commodity, it's such a refined commodity that it's difficult even for the statistics office to pull apart how much is one versus
But
the
this
other.
is because this is really what's only available.
This is a great, well, that's a great segue into chapter 3, if you don't mind. Yeah, okay, so I need to update this. I, until fairly recently, lived in Colorado, and this is just my local supermarket, which I love that it has these signs that say grown in Colorado, which is true. And my only real point here is like, what a cornucopia, and what lucky people we are all around the world to have markets like this that have so much diversity. That is a totally global story of winter crops. And if you're lucky, some other stuff there too, some funky stuff and some new stuff and all that. All right, so what are maybe some of the trade-offs or the costs or the worries about this story? Chapter 1 is amazing interconnectedness. Chapter 2 is because of that globalization, because of that diversification, homogeneity, similarity, diversity leading to similarity, strangely. What are the trade-offs of that? A point I want to make is that, and maybe one of the most important points of all, if you don't care about food, which I've rarely met people that don't care about food entirely, but there may be some people out there, is that I don't think this trend is just about food. And let me just unpack that for a minute. The trend of increasing diversification in localities, and because of that, similarity, homogenization. And so there's a series of papers I'm just going to run through that are, this is about not what we're eating, but what is being cultivated, and also shows in whole regions of the world kind of a diversification and homogenization across the world in the production. What someone was asking me, is this about production or consumption? And in the United States, there's a paper that shows that in regions of the United States. And then if you talk about crop diversity, the varietal diversity itself, this is about modern bred varieties. And there's a whole set of literature that very interestingly shows actually that modern plant breeding will diversify varieties. You'll have all kinds of new genes in there from interesting places, but also in some cases, in a variety, in more than one, quite a few cases, there's also increasing similarity of those varieties with one another. This use of very common genes, for instance, or alleles that get used again and again. That's true in that big review paper. That's true among European maize cultivars, and it's true. Okay, so then we get into a whole set of papers that aren't about modern varieties, but are about what we call land races, which are farmer varieties. And because of increasing connectivity of people and roads and all of that, they're bringing in new diversity, and it's mixing and matching with their local diversity, but that is also making it somewhat more similar at the genetic level to kind of everything else that's out there. It's kind of washing out that local diversity. And that's true in barley in Jordan, and maize in Mexico, pearl millet in Senegal. And then you even get to our wild relatives, which are wild plants that are related to our crops, which for the same case that because of increasing connectivity and the farming going on there and the movement of genes from crops into wild relatives, you get new diversity in those wild relatives. It's new genes, but also they're more similar to everywhere else. And so finally, you get into totally outside of agriculture or even wild relatives, you get into things like fish systems and rivers. And again, because of connectivity, the breakdown of isolation between different river systems and all of that, the movement of invasive species and all of that and then breeding in between, you get new diversity in places and you also get more homogeneity. And so this is where I think this becomes like very interesting and frankly exciting and confusing and concerning all at the same time. Like, I think this is a big story of humanity. It's a story of diversity that comes from globalization and also homogeneity that comes from us kind of having influences from everywhere. So the last couple slides, this isn't a graph. Anybody know what this is? It is a subway. It looks like London. It's even more complicated than London. I think it's maybe the biggest subway in the world. I haven't been to Beijing and I haven't seen a picture of it. Tokyo, the Tokyo subway. And I like this slide just because I saw a piece of news a while back and it was talking about a breakdown in the Tokyo subway, one line over lunch hour during a weekday, and hour and a half breakdown of this system. And it affected 1.5 million people. And what I learned from that is that, like, this is a really, really efficient, really effective system that when it breaks down, affects a lot of people. And my posit to you is that the more we interconnect and globalize in these systems, and honestly, the more people we have, the more dietary expectations they have and all that stuff, the more it better work. And in this case, it means the more that the wheat and the maises and the rices and these other few things better work year after year. I myself used to be a farmer or thought of myself as a farmer for some years, and I value farmers a lot. I also don't envy farmers or the whole system because it is a increasingly scary thing to feed the world, in my opinion. So what are we losing along the way? We got to talk about beans because it's my background and one of my deep interests, and we have some folks in the crowd that I've managed to get deeply interested in beans too. So what this data doesn't talk about, but there is quite a lot of anecdotal and then some good research on, is the loss of local diversity because of this globalization story. And that is some species, actual food species disappearing, but more often varieties and genetic diversity that is disappearing. And this is more of a picture of varietal diversity of beans. What would it be to think about how you might keep around or recapture or re-enlive in local food diversity systems is a fascinating one, and I certainly don't have an answer to. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world thinking about this every day and working on it, including in our community here. But I just want to throw out that there's also, we're still in a time period. I think that we are past peak diversity in our food system, actually, in terms of the amount. Okay, it takes a long time to create diversity. Maybe in the future, or not so long from now, we're mixing and matching so much that we're creating new species all the time. But generally, things take thousands of years to be domesticated and be around, and they get lost very quickly. And I think that in that arc of human history, I think we are probably past peak diversity in terms of our whole amount of like species and varieties and genetic diversity in food. But that doesn't mean that it's all gone. And there are still things around that are kind of totally outside our food system, but were created by people, and they were like thousands of years of history that are kind of on the edge. And this is one of those crops. And this crop was considered to be one of the most important crops by native peoples in the United States, what is now the United States, when the Pilgrims arrived. And this crop was in the first Thanksgivings. And this crop, actually, if maize hadn't come up and become so important, might have been the most important crop in this part of the world. Not this part, really, but sort of St. Louis to Cape Cod part of the world. Anybody know what this this crop is? Good guess. What's that? Very good. Who said that? Good. Awesome. I've taught my group well. No, I didn't actually teach you any of that. This is called Apios or Apios americana. That's the genus Apios. This is called potato bean or Indian bean. It's in the legume family. It's a nitrogen fixer. It's high protein, which legumes typically are, but it's a tuber. And among other reasons why I love it, is that there are parts of the world in which tubers are the most important caloric source, and those are associated with low protein deficient diets typically around the world. And so if you had a higher protein tuber, that would really make a big impact on parts of this world. This crop kind of disappeared because of Europeans coming in and because of maize and all kinds of other things, but it is still around. There was a professor in the southeastern United States that created a collection, tried to do some breeding on it. He retired, and this whole collection, which was basically the diversity of cultivated stuff anymore, almost around it all, almost disappeared. Some thoughtful people got it to the USDA system at the Iowa State University, and so there's a collection there that's public. You can ask for these varieties of these, and if there's any plant breeders out there, you can try to do what needs to be done to make this more out there. And I would also like to say that San Diego Botanic Garden is in this now with some other institutions. I'm excited about this crop. Real quick on this one, they call it a permaculture crop. It's a perennial. It grows like in a season, it will grow like 30 feet up, but and its tubers will tuber, but it tubers with like a meter in between tubers, which makes it incredibly difficult. And so in my opinion, maybe somewhat conservative, it actually needs to be annualized and dwarfed like a potato. Like if you pull in the tubers so that they're all right there like a potato, and you make the plant manageable to grow, this would be a really productive crop. And we know actually how to do that. It just takes some reading to do that. Actually wonder, okay, so thank you for asking that. So I fed my family, I know we need to wrap up here in a minute. I fed my family, do you mind 5 more minutes? Is that okay? Thank you. All right, I fed my family some of this for Thanksgiving one year, that we all got like a spoonful because I didn't obviously have very much of it. Honestly, it's a very good, I mean, everything tastes good as a mashed potato, right? But it was it's like a nutty potato. I thought it was fabulous, personally. This is not, like, no cost to the taste, in my opinion, from a good potato. Of course, potatoes have different uses. There's starchy ones and wetter ones and all that stuff. This is maybe on the wetter side. All right. Because we are past peak, and because even though there's a lot of people out there interested, there's more disappearing than interest. I think we are in an arc period, and the places that can keep this diversity around are important, and those places are seed banks, they are botanic gardens, they are gene banks, they are including this place that you all have visited today or work in. And I think that work is critical in this arc of food diversity period. And it's really wonderful also that we have global collaborations like this one in the Arctic Circle that will hold seeds for every country, or even the San Diego Botanic Garden. And so we plan to duplicate some of our seeds up at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault within the next year or two, to just have a safety backup up there of some of our most important native plants. It's also really important to be doing this work in their spots where this diversity comes from. And this is actually a picture of 4 different national forest lands in the United States wherein wild cranberries occur. Wild cranberries. They're very different ecologies and have very different genetic diversity within them. There's been genetic studies that have done that, and so the Forest Service, along with some agricultural scientists and myself and others, are trying to figure out, okay, which are the areas where you should pay some special concern to make sure that the populations don't disappear because of climate change or other land uses in these national forests and all of that. But of course, if you don't have the diversity out in farmers' fields, evolving with pests and diseases and with climate change and all of that stuff, then it's not really evolving in real time if it's just in a seed bank or just in a botanic garden. And so We're also involved in some really wonderful work in the center of origin of crops, where those crops have been for thousands of years. In this case, 7,000 years in this valley at least. This is Peru,